I am choosing to do a little video response for the UDL Learner Variability and Educational Equity piece of our module assignment. I chose two different articles and a podcast for my readings. The first one was Loch Ness Monster, Yetis, Bigfoot, and Learning Styles, which I definitely chose because of the title, and I found very interesting. The premise of the article is that our brains are not wired for a single style of learning. It's more seen as what we preference. And it was definitely like an aha moment for myself, because I've noticed that I have kind of consigned myself to defining myself as a certain with a certain style of learning, and I always saw myself as like a visual learner, an auditory learner, and that's not necessarily the case. It's more of just what I prefer. And what I found especially interesting is last quarter for one of our classes, one of the first assignments that we had was to it was a multiple choice style test online to see what our learning style was. And so it just kind of goes to show how there's a lot of these like perceptions still in education, even at the university level, that we're continuing to follow along with or spread or pass on. I think one of my takeaways for that article in specific was, well, one, we must be self-aware of our like strengths, our needs, and our preferences, but also not to shortchange the learning process by catering to one learning style. It goes into UDL of like providing multiple options for students to be able to expand all the different types of learning styles, because they have all of those within them inherently. They just are used to maybe tapping into one more than the other. Also, this concept of multiple intelligence was new to me, especially the 8 original ones. Reflecting on about my own learner variability, I definitely see how I'm probably leaning more towards visual, spatial, interpersonal, maybe some interpersonal, and naturalist. And the second article I read was UDL and the Learning Brain. This one was a lot more complex for me to kind of wrap my brain around, because it was all about how our brains are constructed in our neurological organization for engagement, representation, action, and expression, which I guess are the 3 kind of fundamental pieces of UDL. I was sharing in our Saturday seminar during our breakout groups that UDL is something that I don't know very much about, especially just the basic design platform. I can kind of understand and grasp the idea behind it as far as trying to make instruction equitable for all learning styles and approaches, but this kind of helped me understand the whole why, what, how, and how our lesson plans now are designed with that in mind. And last quarter we took a course on how to create lesson plans, and one of the biggest pieces of it was connecting to former knowledge, and I didn't really understand just how important that was until reading this article, when it spoke about how our brain plasticity and how previous experiences drive our interest and engagement, perception, attention, goals, and actions. And then the other big piece, which is that, this backwards design for learning that we're learning about, where you really need to start with the goal before you construct your lesson, because that's what you're going to be constructing your lesson around. And this article kind of like dives into, yes, background knowledge and experience are vital, and a clear goal is essential because it helps to drive the nervous system. And it says be explicit so students know the target, how to reach it, and when they achieve it. It seems really self-explanatory when you say it out loud, but I didn't quite understand just like how valuable it was to making it accessible for students so that they can understand what they're working towards and be able to conceive it from a neurological standpoint. So that was very fascinating. The final one I did was a podcast, If Equity is a Priority, UDL is Must, and I really liked this. And going back into our learner variability, and I get a chance to listen to podcasts or recordings, I think it helps. I don't know if it's like something that fires up in my brain in a different way, but I feel like I'm like resonating with it in a different way than even when I'm just reading it. And that's why I've been really actually enjoying doing these video responses, because I feel like I'm able to verbalize my thoughts a little bit more expansively than if I was to be writing them down. If equity is a priority, UDL is a must. I really appreciated this podcast. I spoke a little bit more expansively about UDL as a design and like what the premise is and how it's different from just differentiated instruction, which I didn't quite understand the differences. Something that was a huge takeaway for me is how UDL is based on fresh formative assessment. So you're not predetermining what students need based on whatever knowledge you might have about a student's ability or disability, which can be pretty problematic when implicit bias comes into the equation. And I had a little aha moment with that in the sense that I worked in SEL classrooms for the last 7 years, and a lot of my assignments that I would do, I would kind of cater them to be kind of artsy creative, like, drawing comprehension or comic book writing, because a lot of my students were very resistant to writing. And I encountered a student or two that just didn't like to draw and didn't want to do that, and I couldn't wrap my mind around it because I'm like, well, but it seems like this is something that's just so approachable and easy for everyone. But it's, again, going into different ways to express our comprehension of the information that we're trying to provide them. And I liked that this podcast really went into, when it comes to creating goals, really focusing on like, what's that learning target, and are we putting in more to that learning target than it's asking. And they use the example of teaching students about communicable diseases, and we're like, this isn't a writing piece, this is an awareness piece of how to identify and deal with communicable diseases from the CDC. So I really appreciated this concept of the buffet. There's multiple different avenues that you can approach this learning from, and you must give up some of your power in the classroom, which I think is a good reminder to let students choose what kind of path they want to take to get to that same end goal of comprehension or understanding around that goal. They just said that there's many pathways for students to share what they know, and that can include like notes in a notebook or a graphic organizer or podcast or infographic. And it kind of started firing up my brain as to how I can kind of incorporate all these like different avenues of like expressing knowledge within my field. I know emphasis was on including thoughts concerning what you know and wonder about your own learner of variability. I spoke a little bit about how I might vary in the sense of my preferences towards more visual auditory learning, but I all have ADHD, ADD, and I grew up, I was diagnosed, I want to say, I was identified in about 4th grade, but diagnosed, I think, in middle school, and started taking medication in high school, and I still do to this day, although I've had gaps where I didn't take those meds. I think it's a much more open and accepting world when it comes to students who have, attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder, or are aware of what those symptoms are. That's not, bad kids, they're just wakely, or they get distracted a little bit more, like a lot more tactile. In my day, people weren't as aware. And so I'm glad that I have that lens of awareness when it comes to looking at how students interact in the classroom. I appreciate that UDL is becoming more commonplace, and so that we can approach every student no matter what their learning needs or preferences or backgrounds are. So thank you.